In the summer of 1944, during World War II, Allied bombers launched massive air raids on German cities, killing thousands of civilians. These attacks left entire cities in ruins and fueled deep resentment among the German people, especially toward the British and Americans. On August 26, 1944, just one day after a particularly destructive bombing raid, a group of furious residents in Rüsselsheim took matters into their own hands. Armed with sticks, rocks, and shovels, they attacked 6 captured American airmen, beating them to death. The main person responsible for this brutal act was Josef Hartgen, who later faced the ultimate punishment for his crime. Josef Hartgen was born in 1904 in Rüsselsheim, which was then part of the German Empire. He worked at the Opel Company from 1928, a time when Opel dominated the German car market with a 37.5% share and was the country's top automobile exporter. In March 1929, the American corporation General Motors saw potential in Opel's advanced production system and bought 80% of the company for $33.3 million, worth over $800 million today. By 1931, General Motors had taken full control of Opel, making it entirely American-owned. When Adolf Hitler came to power in January 1933, his government immediately started preparing for war. His goal was to expand German territory, what he called Lebensraum, or living space, by conquering Poland and the Soviet Union. This plan shaped Nazi foreign policy, which focused on removing the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles, bringing ethnic German regions into the Reich, taking over Eastern Europe, forming alliances, and, after war broke out on September 1, 1939, convincing other countries to join the plan to exterminate all European Jews, known as the Final Solution. Josef Hartgen worked as a foreman at Opel, a company that stopped making cars in October 1940. This happened after its American leadership refused to switch to making weapons. By 1942, Opel was producing war materials, including aircraft parts and tanks. By 1944, the Allies had gained control of the skies. American fighter planes had nearly wiped out the German Luftwaffe, making it harder for Germany to defend itself. The Allied bombing campaign aimed to destroy Germany's weapons factories, disrupt transport routes, and cut off crucial supplies like oil, steel, and coal. On August 24, 1944, an American B-24 bomber with the unusual nickname Wham! Bam! took off from England. Piloted by Second Lieutenant Norman Rogers, Jr., the plane was part of a massive air raid involving over 2,000 aircraft. Their target was an airfield near Hanover. As they approached, they came under heavy anti-aircraft fire. Just after dropping their bombs, the plane was hit multiple times, suffering serious damage. A direct hit in the bomb bay wrecked the hydraulic system, disabled one engine, and left 2 others barely working. With the aircraft critically damaged, the crew had no choice but to bail out. All 9 crew members parachuted into farmland below. One of the crew members, Forrest Brinnenstuhl, was badly injured in the stomach while parachuting down. After landing, an elderly farming couple found him and gave him first aid. Within hours, most of the crew were captured by the Luftwaffe and taken in for questioning. That night, they were held at a nearby air base. Thanks to their pilot, Lieutenant Norman Rogers, insisting on medical care, Brinnenstuhl was taken to a doctor who performed surgery on his wound before transferring him to a hospital for further treatment. The next morning, while Brinnenstuhl stayed behind in the hospital, the rest of the crew were put on a train heading to a prisoner of war camp near Frankfurt. As the train passed through German towns, furious locals gathered outside, shouting insults, shaking their fists, and spitting at the captured airmen, calling them terror flyers. During the journey, the train was forced to stop near Rüsselsheim, about 25 kilometers west of Frankfurt, because the tracks had been destroyed by bombing. The guards ordered the prisoners off and began marching them on foot, expecting to find another train beyond the damaged area. As they walked closer to the town, They saw the devastation left behind by a massive bombing raid just hours earlier. On the night of August 25, 1944, the British Royal Air Force had launched a heavy attack on Rüsselsheim, aiming to destroy the Opel factory, which was producing aircraft parts for the war. The British dropped about 675 metric tons of bombs and over 400,000 incendiary devices. The factory was reduced to rubble, and large parts of the town, including its historic center, were destroyed. The fires were so intense that pilots flying more than 160 kilometers away could still see the flames. Nearly half of Rüsselsheim's homes were wiped out. Out of the 198 people who died that day, all but 12 were forced laborers working at the Opel factory. Josef Hartgen, who was also an air raid warden, organized residents to help put out the fires that were consuming their homes. As the 8 captured American airmen were forced to march through Rüsselsheim, the city was still burning. Smoke filled the air, carrying the scent of destruction and death. The townspeople, grieving their losses, were overwhelmed by anger and sorrow. When the airmen came into view, 2 German women, Margaret Witzler and Käthe Reinhardt, began shouting, "There are the terror flyers. They were here last night. They destroyed our homes. Tear them apart. Beat them to death. Kill them. We cannot show them mercy." One of the American crew members who spoke German desperately responded, "It wasn't us. We didn't bomb Rüsselsheim." But the mob didn't listen. A woman hurled a brick at them, striking Lieutenant Norman Rogers on the left side of his head, cracking his skull. This set off a violent riot. The enraged crowd attacked the prisoners with anything they could find: rocks, hammers, sticks, and shovels. The German guards, who were supposed to protect the prisoners, stood by and did nothing. Things took an even darker turn when Josef Hartgen joined in. Holding a pistol, he became the most brutal attacker. First, he grabbed a stick, similar to a hoe handle, and beat the airmen mercilessly. One was so badly injured that his right shoulder and upper chest were crushed, and a piece of stone was lodged in his skull. Once the men were barely conscious, Hartgen dragged their bodies to the side of the road, lining them up. Furious, he yelled that he would put them out of their misery. Walking along the row of beaten men, he shot 6 of them in the head. But when he ran out of bullets, 2, William Adams and Sidney Brown, were left alive. The townspeople then loaded the battered airmen onto a cart and took them to the cemetery. But when they arrived, some of the men were still groaning, struggling to move. This only fueled the mob's rage further. Those who showed signs of life were beaten again with wooden clubs. Before they could finish their brutal attack, an air raid siren suddenly blared. Panic set in, and the mob scattered, leaving the cart behind. It was later rumored that some of the men had been buried alive. Amidst the chaos, Adams and Brown, the 2 who hadn't been shot, managed to crawl away from the blood-soaked cart. They escaped toward the Rhine River, avoiding capture for 4 days. Unfortunately, Adams and Brown were eventually discovered by policemen. They were captured and taken to their original destination, the German prisoner of war transit camp for captured airmen in Ober-Ursel. They remained there until the war in Europe came to an end. After Germany's surrender, Rüsselsheim fell under the control of the U.S. Third Army. When reports of the killing surfaced, an investigation was launched, and on June 28, 1945, the bodies of the murdered airmen were located. To the shock of the Americans, the victims were not British pilots, as previously believed, but U.S. airmen. 11 residents of Rüsselsheim were arrested, including Josef Hartgen, the leader of the attack. While in jail, Hartgen attempted to take his own life by slashing his wrist on the metal springs of his mattress. However, he was rushed to the hospital, treated, and then returned to his cell to await trial. The trial took place in late July 1945, with 11 defendants facing justice. The defense argued that Nazi propaganda had influenced the townspeople, convincing them that American airmen were war criminals who deserved punishment. However, the prosecution, led by Lieutenant Colonel Leon Jaworski, who would later become famous as the special prosecutor in the Watergate scandal, rejected this excuse. He emphasized that every individual was responsible for their own actions, stating, They were all grown men and women. If they are called on to commit murder, and they do, they are just as responsible as any other murderers. The trial lasted 6 days, featuring harrowing eyewitness accounts of the brutal attack. Testimonies painted Hartgen as particularly vicious in his treatment of the defenseless airmen. On August 2, 1945, the court found Hartgen and 6 others guilty, sentencing them to death. Among those convicted were Margarete Witzler and Käthe Reinhardt, the 2 women who had incited the mob by shouting at the airmen. However, after emotional appeals from their families, arguing that their only crime was screaming, their sentences were reduced to 30 years of hard labor. Hartgen also tried to escape execution. His wife pleaded for mercy, citing their 3 young children, while a former mayor of Rüsselsheim vouched for his character. His supervisor at the Opel factory even described him as a hard-working and independent foreman. None of these pleas made a difference.
On November 10, 1945, 41-year-old Josef Hartgen and 4 others were hanged at Bruxelles prison. The executioner was U.S. Army Sergeant John C. Woods, known for his unorthodox methods. His executions were infamous because he deliberately miscalculated the drop, causing the condemned to strangle slowly instead of dying instantly from a broken neck. Some of the Nazi war criminals he executed suffered for several agonizing minutes before dying. Although Hartgen was seen kissing a cross before his execution, his actions a year earlier left no room for sympathy. When a bystander had tried to stop the beatings in Rüsselsheim, Hartgen had turned to him and warned, "Be quiet, or the same thing will happen to you." In the end, there were no tears shed for Josef Hartgen.